When Hannah accepted a pet-sitting gig in a remote neighborhood, she thought it'd be an easy job. She'd be watching Daisy, an elderly Labrador, for a family out of town. But right after they left, she noticed an older man, her neighbor Mr. Thompson, watching her from his window with an unsettling intensity. "Be careful in there," he warned one day as she took Daisy outside. Strange things happen in that house. The way he said it made Hannah shiver. Every day Mr. Thompson appeared to tell her more about the family in the house. "You know, they're not as normal as they seem," he'd say, hinting at dark secrets with a strange glint in his eye. One night, as she was about to lock up, she heard a soft creak behind her. She turned to see Daisy standing rigid, eyes fixed on the doorway, growling. "What is it, girl?" Hannah whispered. Then she heard it, footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, growing louder. Her heart pounded as she grabbed Daisy and backed into the corner. Is someone there?" Her voice trembled in the silence. The next day, determined to find answers, Hannah explored the house, eventually finding a locked door leading to the basement. She managed to force it open, revealing a dark, musty room with boxes and dusty furniture. In the corner, she found an old photo album, its pages filled with photos of the family and Daisy as a puppy. But in the background of every photo, she noticed something chilling, a shadowy figure standing behind the family, its face blurred. What is this?" she whispered, feeling cold fingers of fear wrap around her heart. At that moment, she heard Mr. Thompson's voice behind her. "That's their little secret." Mr. Thompson continued to share his unsettling knowledge. "They brought something into that house, something that doesn't belong here." Hannah stared at him, unnerved. "What do you mean?" "They had a daughter who went too far," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Daisy's not the only one who's watching you." That night, Hannah lay in bed, tense and unable to sleep. Every sound made her jump, her mind racing with fear. And then, in the middle of the night, she heard a soft scratching at her door, followed by Daisy's low growl. In desperation, Hannah checked the attic the next day and found more disturbing newspaper clippings. They detailed the family's past, a daughter who had mysteriously vanished after dabbling in the occult. The articles hinted that Daisy might have been more than just a pet to the daughter. She was a kind of guardian, tasked with keeping the spirit at bay. Hannah ran to Mr. Thompson, frantic for answers, but when she knocked, his door swung open, revealing an empty, dusty house that looked abandoned for years. She asked a neighbor, who looked at her in horror. "Mr. Thompson," the neighbor said. "He died 20 years ago. He was suspected of, well, harming the family's daughter." The realization hit her like a punch. "But he's been talking to me every day." Terrified, she returned to the house to grab her things and leave. But as she reached the doorway, she heard a familiar voice from behind her. "You're not leaving, are you, Hannah?" She spun around to see Mr. Thompson standing there, his face twisted with a cruel smile, his eyes darker than shadows. "You're part of this now." Daisy began barking wildly, snapping at the figure. Hannah screamed, backing away. "This can't be happening. You're dead." With a mocking laugh, Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his form flickering like static. "No, Hannah, you are." In an instant, everything went black. When she awoke, she was lying in the basement, bound and cold. But there was no one there, just the echo of Mr. Thompson's laughter and a newspaper clipping by her side with her own face on it. "Local pet sitter goes missing." Years later, new families moved into the neighborhood, and the rumors began again. Sometimes the sound of a barking dog was heard in the night, and a ghostly figure, known to neighbors as Mr. Thompson, was often seen standing in the window, watching the street with a sinister smile, his eyes glinting as if daring anyone to enter. Emma's first impression of the old Victorian house was how silent it was. Mrs. Calloway, the elderly homeowner, had asked her to watch her black cat, Midnight, who had an odd habit of staring at empty corners, his green eyes tracking something invisible. "Just take good care of him," Mrs. Calloway had said, a strange look in her eye. "He's my only family now." On the first night, Emma noticed Midnight acting strangely. The cat would stare at the corners, his back arched, growling softly. At one point he hissed and backed away as though something was coming closer. "Easy, Midnight. There's nothing there," she whispered, trying to calm him. But deep down, she felt it too, a cold, lurking presence. Around midnight, Emma heard a faint creak. Midnight froze, his eyes locked onto the doorway. "Did you hear that too?" she asked, heart pounding. Midnight only hissed, never taking his eyes off the darkness. The following night, Emma was woken by the sound of footsteps slowly pacing in the hallway outside her door. Midnight sat up beside her, his eyes wide, fixated on the door. "Hello, is someone there?" she called, clutching her phone, her heart racing. The footsteps stopped. Then she heard a soft whisper, close, like it was right next to her ear. "Emma." She nearly dropped her phone, her breath caught in her throat. Midnight jumped off the bed, hissing at the corner of the room. By the third night, Emma was on edge. Midnight had started to behave erratically, often yowling and swatting at the air, and she could feel the presence growing stronger. The lights flickered, and a cold breeze swept through the room. Midnight's gaze darted toward the corner, his fur puffed as he growled low and steady. The temperature plummeted, and she could swear she saw a faint outline, a shadow lingering in the corner. "I'm here to protect you," came a faint voice, almost like a whisper from the shadow itself. "From what?" Emma asked, barely able to speak. The voice didn't answer, but Midnight hissed louder as if warning her. Emma searched the house the next day, desperate for answers. In the attic, hidden behind some dusty boxes, she found an old photograph, a young woman with piercing green eyes, eerily similar to Mrs. Calloway's. On the back, it read, "Lydia, 1980. She returned downstairs, clutching the photograph. Mrs. Calloway was waiting in the living room, her face pale. You found her, didn't you?" Mrs. Calloway asked, her voice trembling. "Who is she?" Emma whispered, feeling the chill creeping up her spine. "My twin sister Lydia," Mrs. Calloway replied, her gaze fixed on the photograph. "She was killed here by something, and she's been watching over Midnight ever since." Emma agreed to stay one more night, hoping to help Lydia's spirit find peace. But as soon as darkness fell, the presence returned, stronger than ever. Midnight started yowling, his eyes wild, as a chilling wind filled the room. The lights flickered, and suddenly the voice was there again, echoing in her ears. "Get out! You're not safe!" Emma felt something brush against her arm, a cold, bony hand. She screamed, backing against the wall as the shadow moved closer. Midnight leapt between her and the shadow, yowling louder than she'd ever heard. Suddenly the figure came into focus, and Emma realized with horror that it wasn't Lydia's ghost at all. "I'm not Lydia," the shadow whispered, a twisted smile forming as its face came into the light. "Lydia didn't survive, but I did." Emma fled the house, Midnight clutched in her arms. She never returned, but she later discovered the truth. Mrs. Calloway's sister had been something far darker, a malevolent entity that had taken Lydia's life but stayed hidden, feeding on the fear of those who remained. Midnight, who had witnessed it all, was her only protector. Years later, Emma sometimes thought she saw the shadowy figure out of the corner of her eye, a reminder of the night she came face to face with the invisible guest and barely escaped. Story 3. The Midnight Visitor, a disturbing pet-sitting encounter. "It'll just be you and Max," Mrs. Riley said with a warm smile as she handed over the keys. "He's a gentle dog, but he gets nervous alone." Lily agreed to house-sit for the weekend. The Rileys' large, isolated home was a bit eerie, but she couldn't pass up the extra cash. Max, their old golden retriever, had a watchful, almost unnerving stare, especially as he followed her every move in the empty house. Lily curled up on the couch watching a movie when Max suddenly growled, his gaze fixed on the front window, She froze, heart racing as she turned to look. A figure was standing outside, just beyond the light, perfectly still. "Hello?" she called, barely a whisper. No answer. The figure just stared, unmoving. Her phone was in her hand, but she couldn't bring herself to dial. After what felt like an eternity, the figure backed into the darkness and vanished. The second night was even worse. At midnight, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Max whined, pressing against her leg as the footsteps approached, stopped, and then resumed, inching closer. "Who's there?" she stammered, gripping Max as he growled softly. The footsteps stopped, and a scratchy whisper echoed through the closed door. "I'm closer than you think." Her heart raced as the door handle rattled. She held her breath, praying it was locked. Unable to bear it any longer, she dialed 911. As she described the situation, the lights flickered out, plunging the house into darkness. The only sound was her rapid breathing, and then the slow creak of the front door. "I know you're here," the voice called softly, sending chills down her spine. She huddled in the closet, clutching Max, who whimpered as footsteps grew louder and closer. She squeezed her eyes shut as she heard the intruder's ragged breathing just outside the closet. Finally, she heard sirens approaching. A loud voice yelled, "Police, show yourself!" But when she emerged, the intruder was gone. Officers searched the house, but no one was found. All they discovered was a single note on her bed. Lily moved out the next day, but the incident haunted her. Several months later, she received a call from a detective investigating a string of break-ins. "Did you know Mrs. Riley?" he asked gravely. "Yes, I pet sat for her." "Well, she didn't live there alone," the detective explained. Her brother, who'd been in hiding due to some mental health issues, was using the attic as his own space. He'd been there for months, watching over whoever stayed. Lily's blood ran cold. She remembered the noises, the notes, the feeling of being watched. As she hung up, she felt something cold brush her arm. She turned, gasping at the sight of a face in the window, vanishing before she could scream. "I told you I'd see you again," a voice whispered, lingering in the air. Hannah had been looking forward to a quiet week pet-sitting in a quaint countryside house. Her main responsibility was taking care of Max, an older German shepherd with a gray muzzle and watchful eyes. Max had a calm demeanor, but every now and then his ears would prick up and he'd stare intently at something beyond her sight. One evening, while making tea, she glanced out the kitchen window and froze. There, in the darkened yard, a figure stood beneath a tree, just on the edge of the property line. They were dressed in black, their face obscured, but Hannah could feel their gaze fixed on her. "Hello?" she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. The figure didn't respond, only watched in eerie silence. When she blinked, they were gone. The next morning, Hannah found something strange on the doorstep. A small, carved figurine of a dog that looked just like Max. The carving was weathered, as though it had been left outside for years. She showed it to Max, who sniffed it and then backed away, growling softly. "Where did this come from, boy?" she murmured, unsettled. She looked out over the yard but saw no sign of the figure from the night before. As dusk fell, Max grew restless, pacing back and forth. Then, as Hannah checked the windows, she saw it again. The same shadowy figure, this time closer, just beyond the gate. Her heart raced as the figure raised a hand and pointed directly at her. "Who are you?" she shouted, gripping the windowsill. But there was no response, only silence. That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. Max lay by the bed, his ears alert, watching the door as though expecting something or someone. Around midnight, a scraping sound echoed through the house. Hannah bolted upright, her pulse hammering in her ears. She crept toward the window, peeking through the blinds. The figure was back, now standing right by the front steps, staring up at her window. She stifled a scream, backing away as Max began barking furiously, his hackles raised. "Stay away," she whispered to herself, clutching her phone in her hand. But the figure remained, motionless and watching. In a surge of panic, she ran to the door and threw it open, Max bounding ahead of her. But outside, the figure had vanished. leaving only muddy footprints trailing away into the woods. Hannah finally decided to call the homeowners, explaining the strange events. The woman on the phone went silent for a moment. Did you say a man in black?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Yes," Hannah replied, and he left a carved figure of Max on the doorstep. The woman sighed, sounding defeated. "Years ago, there was a man who used to live in the area. He claimed that Max's soul was special, a guardian of sorts. He was obsessed with the idea, said he could see something in Max that no one else could. He disappeared. But maybe he's come back." "What do you mean, a guardian?" Hannah asked, a chill creeping over her. I don't know," the woman admitted, "but be careful. He believed Max held the key to something dark, something he wanted." The next night, Hannah locked all the doors and windows, determined not to let the figure get any closer. Max stayed by her side, growling softly as though sensing the danger. At midnight, the scratching began again. This time it was more frantic, like someone was clawing at the door. Hannah's heart thundered as she approached, peering through the peephole. The figure was there, mere inches from the door. His face, hidden beneath a hood, was pale and hollow-eyed, an intense hunger gleaming in his eyes. "Give him to me!" the man rasped, his voice muffled through the door. "He doesn't belong to you, he's mine! Go away!" she screamed, clutching Max close as he barked and snarled. But the figure didn't budge, only continued scratching at the door with long, bony fingers. Desperate, Hannah ran to the back of the house, Max by her side. But as she turned to check behind her, she realized the truth. The figure wasn't after her, he was after Max. As she knelt to comfort the trembling dog, she saw something glinting in his eyes, something ancient and unearthly. It was as though Max's very soul was a gatekeeper to something beyond. The man's words echoed in her mind, "He doesn't belong to you." With a horrible realization, Hannah understood that Max was more than just a dog. He was a vessel, a link to the other world, and the man outside was determined to unlock it. As dawn approached, Hannah made a choice. She grabbed Max's leash, opened the door, and called out. "If you want him, come get him!" she shouted, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The figure emerged from the trees, his eyes gleaming with victory as he approached. But as he reached for Max, the dog lunged, teeth flashing. A blinding light exploded from Max's eyes, illuminating the yard. "No!" the man screamed, recoiling as though he were burning. The light intensified until he was forced to retreat, stumbling back into the darkness, his figure dissolving into the night. Days later, the homeowners returned, and Hannah handed over Max with a heavy heart. As she left, she looked back to see the dog watching her, his eyes still holding that glint of otherworldly wisdom. She never saw the figure again, but sometimes, in the dead of night, she'd hear a faint scratching at her own door, as if something was still searching for her, still trying to unlock what it had failed to claim that night. When Lucy took a pet-sitting job for a talking parrot named Coco, she thought it would be a fun, easy gig. The house was old, filled with antiques, and Coco, a large, colorful bird with a cheeky personality, seemed friendly enough. "Hello, Lucy," Coco chirped on her first night. "Lucy, watch out," he added with a laugh, though there was nothing to worry about. He even mimicked footsteps down the hall, which Lucy found amusing at first. But on her second night, as she was getting ready for bed, Coco repeated something unsettling. "They're coming, Lucy." "Who's coming, Coco?" she asked, a chill creeping down her spine. Coco simply tilted his head, blinking slowly, and remained silent. The next morning, Lucy woke up to find Coco's cage door wide open, and Coco was gone. She scoured every corner of the house, calling his name, but the silence was heavy, the house unnaturally still. On the floor beneath the cage, she noticed something strange, a trail of feathers leading toward the basement door. She shivered, remembering that the homeowner had specifically told her not to enter the basement. "Stay out," they'd warned. "It's dangerous down there." But where else could Coco be? Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Every time she turned, she thought she saw shadows flitting in the corner of her eye, and at night, she could swear she heard Coco's voice echoing faintly through the house. "Help me, Lucy," the voice whispered one evening, faint and trembling. She followed the sound to the basement door, which now seemed to emit a low hum, as though something on the other side was waiting. Her fingers trembled as she tried the doorknob, but it was locked tight. That night, she found an old, torn-up notebook on the kitchen counter that she was certain hadn't been there before. It was filled with strange scrawls and drawings of a parrot, Coco, alongside unsettling phrases. He sees them. The door must stay closed. They won't let him go. Lucy reached out to the homeowners, but there was no answer, only the eerie quiet of the house. Desperate, she researched the history of the house and found a disturbing story. Years ago, the previous owner had kept a parrot named Coco, who had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. Rumors swirled that Coco had seen something he shouldn't have in the basement and vanished soon after. The stories claimed that the bird had been able to mimic the voices of people who hadn't spoken to him directly, voices from somewhere else. On the fifth night, Lucy awoke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from below her room. They were slow, dragging, and seemed to be coming from the basement. Gathering her courage, she decided to open the basement door. She descended slowly, her flashlight casting long shadows on the cold stone walls. Then, faintly, she heard Coco's voice echoing from the depths of the room. "Help! Lucy, please!" Following the voice, she turned a corner and froze. There, in the center of the basement, was Coco's cage, but it was twisted and rusted, as if it had been there for years. "Lucy." Coco's voice echoed again, but it sounded distorted, hollow. Then she heard another voice, one she didn't recognize, a whisper from behind her. He saw too much. Lucy spun around, but the basement was empty. The door to the basement suddenly slammed shut, leaving her in darkness. Panicked, Lucy tried the door, but it was locked. As she banged on it, desperate to escape, she heard Coco's voice again. "They're here, Lucy. They've always been here." Then she heard laughter, a mix of voices, human and parrot, mocking her in the dark. In her terror, she noticed a faded inscription on the wall, almost like a warning. "Leave what you find. Do not bring back what's lost." In the shadows, she saw a faint, eerie outline of Coco perched on a ledge, but his eyes weren't the gentle ones she'd seen before. They were dark, almost human, watching her intently. "Goodbye, Lucy." Lucy, still locked in the basement, managed to get her flashlight back on. The beam flickered over strange scratch marks along the walls, as though something or someone had clawed frantically at the stone. Just above the twisted cage, she noticed a series of photos pinned to the wall, yellowed with age. They were of Coco, perched on people's shoulders, different people. All of them had the same terrified expression, looking over their shoulder as if something unseen was looming behind them. But then, Lucy's flashlight illuminated something she hadn't expected. A photo of herself, taken from outside the house, showing her holding Coco's cage from her first night. Beneath it, scrawled in smeared ink, was a message. She's seen it too. A whisper filled the room, and this time it wasn't Coco. "You're part of this now, Lucy." She backed away, her heart racing when she heard the sound of flapping wings. Turning, she saw Coco, but he looked different. His feathers dull and his eyes dark, almost predatory. He opened his beak, and in a voice that sounded half human, half parrot, he said, "We can never leave." As she backed away, a cold hand gripped her shoulder, and she screamed as the light went out, leaving her in total darkness. And then, silence. Weeks later, a new pet sitter arrived at the house, greeted by the same seemingly friendly parrot named Coco.